where I come from, nobody works in tech, and getting an offer to work at Pandora, a company that created the music app that I grew up with listening to and loved, was just unreal. All I wanted was for somebody to give me a chance, and Pandora did, and that literally changed my life. Once I began my full-time role at Pandora, there were some other personal doubts that I had to overcome and that I want to share with you all. My team was composed of great experienced engineers, most of whom were men, and so many of my insecurities came from not only being one of the few women in the team, but also from being a young engineer of color. I had to learn to work in an environment with a lot of experienced folks, and developing confidence in my technical skills was something that I had to work on. And so during my first year as a software engineer, I felt like I had to constantly prove myself, prove that I was capable of solving technical problems and make impactful contributions to my team. Of course, my manager never told me that I wasn't doing a good job. On the contrary, he was very supportive and provided help whenever I needed. But as a young engineer starting off, you get this feeling that you have to prove yourself and to others that you are qualified to be there. There were a lot of things that were new to me, and I felt like I was behind everyone else. Working full-time is not the same thing as working in a project or in an internship. When you start working as a full-time engineer, you get onboarded to this large code base, so you have to quickly learn a lot of things. And so the first challenge that I had to overcome was learning how to communicate and work with experienced engineers. The second challenge I faced was being afraid to ask dumb questions. There were so many things that I didn't know about the code base. I felt like all the questions I had were of basic concepts that it wouldn't be helpful to ask because everyone already knew the answer to my basic questions, so I just wouldn't ask them. Instead, I would spend hours reading through the wikis to find answers to my questions. But later on, I learned that I shouldn't have been so hard on myself. When you're ramping up to a new code base, that is the time when you should be asking the most questions. No one expects a new team member to learn the code base in a couple of weeks. It takes years for people to feel fully comfortable with it. And even then, just by the nature of software development, there's always new code being added to the code base, and it's almost impossible to know every part of it. And the third thing that I struggled with was feeling like I wasn't building as fast as others. When I started off, I didn't really know how long a feature should take to develop. And to me, it just felt like I was so much lower than my teams at shipping features. But again, this might not have been the reality. Because of all the doubts I had in my mind, I was so self-conscious about how long it would take for me to write code that I just felt like other people would be able to finish faster. And again, it was just me comparing myself to more experienced engineers with more knowledge of the code base. Of course, if I'm comparing myself to more experienced folks in the team, they are going to be faster at developing features, but the more familiar you become with the code base, the faster you will get. And I would forget that. I would be comparing myself, someone who just started, with somebody who had been in the team for 5 years, and that's not fair. And I really hope you all don't do that when you start your first job. When you start your job, if you feel like you're not making much progress on a feature, I really encourage you all to reach out to your teammates for help. If you succeed, then the product succeeds, and then your whole team succeeds, so it's a benefit for all. And also, when I began working as a full-time engineer, I didn't really know of all the responsibilities of the job. And I thought for most days that I would just be coding up new features, but software engineering is more than just coding. And I want to shed some light on other responsibilities that we have as software engineers. So as a full-time engineer, you have team meetings where you share the status of your work, and product meetings to review requirements, which outlines the features for a project that you will be working on. During those meetings, you will usually get assigned a feature to work on. So let's pretend that you have all been assigned a feature. All right, so what comes next? Then comes the research phase. Engineers are always doing some type of research. This includes looking through the code base to figure out how to implement the feature, doing online research, reading through Stack Overflow posts, reading technical documentation to learn more about the technology that your team uses, or looking through internal documentation. There's a lot of reading that we do on the job that I didn't think engineers had to do when I was in school. Okay, so now that you know how to implement your feature, what happens next? You're gonna have to provide estimations to your manager and product manager about how long it will take to build that feature. This skill is really hard to develop, and this is where your research will really come in handy, because the findings that you'll have will help you determine approximately how long a feature should take. This is a really difficult skill to develop, because you may run into unexpected bugs that you didn't account for in your original estimates. And this is something that I'm still working on. Okay, so now you've done the research, you provided estimation, so now let's get to the fun part. You start developing your feature for your team's product. That could be, your product could be a website, mobile app, or other internal services. Okay, while you develop the feature, you have to test your changes and make sure that they work as expected and fix any bugs along the way. Once you have done that, you'll go ahead and create a pull request, which lets other engineers know about the changes that you're making to the code base. Through pull request is where your team will review your changes and provide and give you any feedback on things that you can improve in your code. So once your code looks good to go, your code changes are approved, then you'll finally push your feature to your team's code base. Everyone has the opportunity to review pull requests, so you will also have the opportunity to provide feedback on other people's code. Okay, so these are some of the responsibilities that may be more commonly known, but there are other responsibilities that we have as engineers that I wasn't aware of when I was starting. Throughout the whole product development process, you have to maintain constant communication with your manager, your team, your product manager, to share status updates, talk about blockers, which are things that may be preventing you from moving forward with your feature, and to let them know when your feature is live. As engineers, you also have the responsibility to write documentation to help share knowledge with the rest of your team. You can write down how a feature should work, what technologies were used to implement it and why. Write down any important business logic that future engineers should know if they ever work on adding enhancements to your feature. And another very important part of the job is being placed on the on-call rotation for your team. This was something that was very new to me. When I first heard of it, I wasn't sure if I would be able to handle all the responsibilities that came with being on call, but I still joined anyway. It really helps when your team supports you and is willing to answer any questions that you may have when you're on the on-call rotation. What this essentially means is when you're placed on call, you are responsible for responding to critical bugs that are affecting your team applications at all hours of the day, even during weekends, at 3 a.m. Whenever an issue arises, it's your job to fix it. And so for that week that you're on call, you are essentially the first line of defense. You fix blockers that are in the production environment of your application, and you communicate with all teams affected by those issues. Also, another responsibility that we have as engineers is we have to provide feedback. Aside from sharing feedback on code changes, you also provide feedback to your teammates through yearly reviews on what they did well and what are some things they could improve. Also, some teams have retrospective meetings that happen after big projects, and the purpose of those meetings is to provide feedback on, again, what worked and didn't work, and you get a chance to provide feedback to the product teams, to the quality assurance team, to your managers and other developers. And the last two responsibilities is we have to question product decisions and help to improve the team processes. It's important to ask context on why you're building a certain feature. Sometimes product managers may come up with complicated solutions to a problem, and if you know of an easier or simpler solution to the same problem, it's your job as an engineer to bring that up to the product team. And also with helping to improve your team's processes, this is just, making the experience of working in a code base better for everybody. You can fix long-standing bugs. You can work on improving the speed of the product. You can help with upgrading versions of the tools you used. There are a lot of ways that you can help to improve your team. And if there's an opportunity to fix something, it's really important to take that initiative, because it helps you stand out, and also it's really helpful when it comes to promotion. Okay, so now that you all have some idea of what we do as full-time software engineers, I like to share some skills that I didn't learn in school but have really helped me at work. The first skill that I want to talk about is learning how to break out a project or a big task into smaller unit of work. Makes it way easier to complete those tasks. When it comes to a project that has a lot of moving parts, it may seem really daunting at first, but if you break it up, you'll see that it's way easier to manage. Whenever I break up a project, I always have an investigation ticket, which keeps track of any important information that I found during the research phase of the feature development process and while looking through the code base. Also, these smaller units of work help you and your managers see the progress that you are making on that feature or project. The next useful skill to have is knowing how to explain complicated technical concepts, implementation, features in simple terms. You're gonna have to often communicate with folks from lots of different backgrounds, so this skill is especially important to have. What helps is when I ask myself, how can I explain this in simple, plain English? And you'll see that it'll come really handy when you're talking to the product teams. The next useful skill to develop is learning how to give insightful opinions about other people's technical solutions. Once you start working, you'll see that people in your team will want feedback on an approach that they have come up with, and being able to give your opinion and asking the right questions is a skill of its own. During my first year, I felt like I didn't have anything to contribute whenever somebody asked for feedback or presented a technical solution. And again, it seemed like my classmates, my teammates would always have all these great questions about edge cases, and I just didn't understand how they were able to come up with such good questions. But what I later learned is that as you get more familiar with the code base and the services that your team works on, the more insightful your questions will become. It's really hard to ask good questions about something that you're not familiar with. That's why it's really helpful to read through your team's technical documentation and get familiar with the code base as soon as possible. The next skill to develop is being able to analyze solutions quickly and decide which one to code. When you start working on features, you'll see that there might be multiple ways of implementing it, and quickly analyzing a solution and deciding which one to pursue is a skill that is important to work on, as it helps you speed up your development process. And lastly, the skill that I found extremely helpful to have is learning how to phrase technical questions so that everyone can understand it. Again, this is helpful when you talk to product managers, and especially now that we're communicating through emails and Slacks, it's a skill to know how to ask questions with just enough context as to not overwhelm the other person, because it's going to help you move quickly in a project and get your questions answered as soon as possible. And this is, again, a skill that I'm still constantly working on. Okay, so now that I've shared some skills that will help you in your first job, I want to talk about information that is also really important to learn before you start or the very first week on the job. The first concept that you should be familiar with is agile software development, and learn more about the process of getting a feature into production. Most tech companies use the agile approach to software development, which means that they emphasize on delivering features incrementally. And I encourage you, when you start, become familiar with the product development process at your company. Ask, what kind of environments does your team have? Does your team have a quality assurance team that helps with testing of new features? All of this information is going to be really helpful and help you develop features faster. To share more information about my team, we have 3 environments. We have develop, stage, and production. Develop is where engineers push all the new features to, and where we use that environment to test our code changes. Stage is used by our quality assurance team, or QA, to fully test out the workflows and confirm that the feature is working as expected. And lastly, production is used by our users, and only tested and approved features go into this environment, because again, this is where our users have access to features, so we don't want to have any bugs in production. It will also be really helpful for you to learn about project tracking systems that your team uses. These are tools that help teams keep track of the features and projects that they work on. At Pandora, we use Jira to create tickets and assign them to engineers. And lastly, estimation techniques. I think this would be really helpful to learn, because it helps to measure how long a feature will take to develop. And if you don't know all this information already, it's okay. I wasn't familiar with any of this when I started, but I think if I did know this, I would have had a smoother transition into my full-time role. Okay, so now I want to talk about some skills that I think are not talked about often enough, but I think are extremely useful for engineers to have. The first is technical confidence. Technical confidence is the feeling or belief that you can solve any technical problem that comes your way. No matter the difficulty, you know that you have the skills to figure it out. This is a crucial skill that I was definitely lacking when I started my first job, but once I developed the technical confidence, it made a big difference. Essentially, technical confidence is what pushes you to take on bigger, more impactful projects, because you believe in yourself and your technical skills and know that you can deliver on time. The more features you complete, the more bugs that you fix, and the more that you deliver projects, you'll see that your technical confidence will start to grow, because now you have evidence of what you are capable of. And I didn't know that. I wasn't aware of technical confidence, but I definitely, now I can't stop thinking about it. It's something that I have to practice on a daily basis at work. And also, part of building your technical confidence is learning to accept that you won't know everything. And that's okay. And learning to be comfortable with that, I think, is a very important part of having that confidence in yourself. And again, this is something that I'm always working on and will have to work on for the rest of my career. The next skill is being proactive. This skill, I think, is really important when it comes to promotions. In every team, there are things that are broken and have been for a long time, but because engineering teams are always swamped with projects, people don't have the time to fix those issues. So if you want to make an impact on your team and get promoted, it is really helpful to look at these things that could be improved. If you're just starting off and you take the initiative to fix a long-standing bug, I think you're gonna make a very good first impression on your team, and it just shows the potential that you have. The next skill that I think is really important to develop is communication adaptability. As engineers, we have to communicate with multiple teams: product, design, analysts, quality assurance team. So being able to communicate based on the style, shift your communication style based on who you're talking to is going to definitely help you achieve your goals faster. And I would encourage you all to learn about what the different types of communication styles are. I know there's 4, and it would be really good to know what your default communication style is. And last but not least, I think it's really important to learn how to advocate for yourself. I didn't really know that I had to do this when I started in the industry, but it really plays an important role when it comes to getting promoted and getting you the help that you need. If you know that there is an important project in your team, tell your manager that you want to work on that project. Don't expect that you'll be placed on any given project just because of how long you've been at the company. You can have some control of the path that your career is taking, and I think a big part of that is through self-advocacy.